Hi, Joe Cerrone.
Al Rosen.
We're going to go through Chapter 7 for CAD 134, Dimensioning and Area Calculations. This chapter covers different ways to dimension, understanding dimension variables. Dimension variables being things like dimension scale, how to set the text height, how to be able to work with things like dimension associativity, which means if I dimension a part and then I change the part size, that the dimension updates with that. And so if I have a room that's 10 feet by 10 feet, and then I stretch it to 12 feet, the dimension automatically updates. And so we kind of take that for granted, but that's some of the things that we'll talk about. We'll work with some dimension styles, and we'll work with area calculations and things like that. CAD goes through a lot of basic dimensioning techniques. Linear, this used to be called horizontal and vertical years ago, and as the CAD systems got more intelligent, they said, you know, it really just depends on the third point you click, because you go endpoint, endpoint, text placement, endpoint, endpoint, text placement. And so when you work with linear dimensioning techniques, you're going to have a horizontal dimension or a vertical dimension. Notice that this is an inclined line, and it still gives it a horizontal dimension value. If you use an aligned dimension command, then it will be parallel to the dimension itself. Arc length, never had the real use for it. I use ordinate a lot in manufacturing. These are great for running machines. All your machines have coordinate systems that tie into the zero origin of the parts that we make. So it's really very neat. This kind of speaks for itself: radius, jog, diameter, and angular. So we have these different dimension variables. You can check the status, or you can hit the F2 key. I just look at the dimension style, and it gives me that information, because this gives me textbook information kind of thing. Terminology: dimension text, dimension line, tick mark, extension line. So you want to be able to talk the vocabulary as you work with it. And these are the things that your CAD manager sets up for you. And so he'll have a title block, and he wants everybody's drawings to look the same. And he'll go in there and set up these different variables in the dimension style. When we work with it, we're working with the dimension style manager. We have this tenant space floor plan that we have provided for you in the module. And this project we'll be using throughout the course. And so you want to keep this file, and we'll be updating it as we go along and do our work with it. And so it's kind of like I always think of it as a mortgage office for some reason. I don't know why, because you walk in the room and there's a couple of desks. There's a bookkeeping office, president's office, a conference room, which we'll start to put furniture in and things like that. And so we get this drawing set up, and then we can set up these different dimension styles. You want to be careful about what it says when it overrides a style. What that means is that you typed in a dimension command while you were not in the dimension style manager. So what does that mean? Well, let's get that drawing right here. Okay, and so here's my rooms that I can go through and calculate out. And then if I go into my dimension styles, I like to type in DDIM. It's faster for me, and hit enter. And this is a student that took the course last semester and went and followed the textbook perfectly with all these different styles. I'm going to make a new style, and I'm going to just call it Joe's Dim Style 1. And then I'm going to get rid of the annotated, and I'm going to continue with that. And so here's my dimension style. Notice that it's very blank. There's not a lot on it. And so I can go in here and I can tell it that I want, under my lines and arrows, that I want, I'll leave that one alone. There's nothing I want to change there. Under symbols, I want ticks. And arrows for my leaders, I'll bump this up to 1/8. I think that'll be okay. Center marks, this 1/32 is really sort of the gap, and I'm not sure why it's not showing up here or in the break style. Text, I can go into my text and I can go with the standard text height. I'll go with city blueprint, and so I'm going to go and find it. There we are. We won't put a text height in it, and I'll set it current. Actually, I'll say new, yes, okay, and then I'll set it current. And then I'll close it. I'll go to the Fit tab, and I'll set up on the Fit tab. We talked about a technique about scaling the dimensions manually. And if I wanted to calculate that out, I'd go in and see what the viewport scale was. But rather than do that, I'm just going to put the dimensions in on the viewport page. And I'm going to say scale dimensions to layout. Primary units will be architectural. Precision, this depends on how finely I will dimension things. 1/16 of an inch is okay. I will not enable alternate units or tolerances. I'll say okay. And I will set current. And I'll close it. I'm a little worried because I don't see any of the dimension annotations in here in my dimension style. So if it doesn't work, if it fails, I may have to come back and see what's going on with it. Double click in the viewport and then put a dimension on. And so I'll say linear dimension from here to here. I'll place that dimension on there and hit enter. And so, yeah, it's got something going on. It just completely blanked it out as far as
layers, Joffrey.
Yeah, here's my layers. So my layer is off. Okay, you're right. So let's go set a different layer. Let's put it on a new layer for dimension. All right. Close enough. Let's set our color for that. I always go with a shade of green on my dimensions. I'll make it current. And keep the current layer on. We'll try this again. So I'm on the dim layer, and now I'm going to go and put in my dimension in the viewport, and it will automatically scale it to that viewport height. And so that's the technique that we're going to use throughout the textbook. If I go back and I check my dimension, Joe's dimension style, and I want to make the text height a little bigger because it is pretty tiny, I can say make the text height 1/4. Or I could say, let's make it 1/8, because I think that was our standard that we were talking about. I'll okay it, I'll close it, and you can see it's updating and working now. Terrific, that's what we wanted to do. Let's go back to our lesson, and let's see if I can find that PDF. There we are. So as we go through and we work with dimensions and creating dimension styles, rather than go through and follow all this textbook stuff, we're just going to explain it to you. The units, primary units, should be architectural units because that will be in feet and inches. And then as far as the symbols and arrows, they say oblique. I use architectural ticks, 6 of one, half a dozen of another. It's not a big deal. Lines, we really don't do anything with this. You know, there's a little bit of a gap that you might set the gap on these extension lines. And so when I used to teach drafting up at NIU, I was a grad student up there, graduate assistant, and I taught the technical drawing courses out there. And I taught them on a pencil back in those days. And you would have to measure the gap. And so there is a little gap that you have before the extension line, and then the amount that extends beyond that. That's what all your dimension style manager does. That's what your CAD manager does. And so when it talks about offset from the origin, 1/16 of an inch, that means you're going to have a 1/16 of an inch from the end point where you started the dimension. So you'll have a little gap there. Extend beyond dimension lines will be this little piece right here, right there. That's what it means. Just really small, tedious things. When you go into the text, yes, text, set up your text height. I set mine up for 1/8 of an inch, and I set my dimension style under text style, the city blueprint. I did not put a text height in there. The text height comes from the dimension style. So you leave the standard dimension, you leave the text style, text height alone, and you let the text height come from the dimension style. Sometimes I like to acquaint them to wrestlers, which one is stronger? The dimension wrestler is stronger than the text style wrestler. Somebody has to win. All right, and then when we get into it, here they are with the text font. Again, no height. You can always adjust the upside down, backwards, obliquing scale factors and things like that. It just makes the text a little squeezed. And here's our fit tab. I'm not using an overall scale. I'm not using annotative. We're using scale dimension to layout. It just works best. And so they talk about calculating out these fit scales and these dim scales. And like we were talking about, what it is, if you're going to do it manually, is it's the common denominator. So 1/8 of an inch equals a foot would be 0.125 equals 12. And if you take 0.125 and divide it by 12, you're going to get 128, I think. It's actually 12 divided by 0.125. 96. So the dim scale would be 96 for that value. All right. And as you look at all of these things, these are things your CAD manager can set for you. All right, and so I'm going to have to move along a little bit because we've got 10 minutes before I've got to get into some other things. Let's see. Continuous dimension styles will just have the dimension continue from the last endpoint. These are really very basic things. And so it'll look like this. You put one dimension on, and then you use dim continue, and it'll keep them all lined up just like that and continue one from the end to the next. Same thing with this area over here. This is an aligned dimension, meaning that it's parallel to the dimension. This is a baseline dimension, meaning you put in the first dimension, and then you choose baseline, and it'll then put the subsequent dimensions, and it will automatically space them apart the proper distances. And so the textbook has you go through and dimension this. We're not going to do that at this point. What we're going to do is calculate out the areas. So in this exercise, it has you go through and create some of these different dimension styles. That's great. We're not going to worry about that at this point. So let's get to work on this. Let's take a look at how you would go through and calculate out areas. This is just a little bit on revision clouds. We use those when we grade your papers. I'm sure you've seen those. Calculating out square footage. And so in this exercise, we'll calculate out the square footage using the area command in the table. And I'm just going to cut right to it. Go to the dimension, go to the drawing for our tenant space plan. You can do this in paper space or model space. I'm going to go into the viewport and double click in there. And if I can touch some of the geometry and it glows like that, that means I'm in the viewport. The president's office is calculated at 304 square feet. How do we do that? We go to the home tab, we go to the utilities for area. And then what we want to do is we want to go and we want to click around the area. Now, Do I want to go around this? Sure. Let's be as accurate as possible. Let's say that the president has very expensive taste and he wants some new carpet. And so we want to get the exact size for that. So we can come over here, go to that corner, hit enter, and then that will give us our area in square feet. And so we have 304 square feet with a perimeter of 72. So we can hit enter, and then we can go to our table in paper space, double click into the paper space, or this one's actually another viewport, and just fill out the table as appropriately. Do the same for the other rooms. Do the office. Okay, I'll do one more, and then we'll open things up for questions. Again, to calculate out the area, we go to the area command, and we can just chain through there. You can create a polyline and then analyze the polyline as well. So I'll do one more example just to show you what I mean by that. And so we go right here, hit enter, and here's my calculation, 162.6 square feet. And then if I come back here and look at my values, we rounded it up to 163. Always better not to be short. If you have something like a room that has like a round feature, let's say that the reception room was changed and we put in here an arc. And my phone's going off. Let's try that again with an arc. It just doesn't want to let me play. Let's go back here, try it again. 3-point arc. 1, 2, 3. There we go. So let's say that's our reception room. Excuse me. Let's say that's our reception room. What you can do is you can make this into a shape by using a polyline. And I realize it's got a little bit of a spot that's off, but I think we can worry about that later. Like that. And so here's my polyline. And what I'll do is I'll join it. P-edit. Select the polyline. And I'll join. You could also do this with a region, probably a better way to do it, maybe a little bit newer. But now if I hover over it, now that's a shape. And so if I have rooms that aren't square and I can't pick up the corners, what I can do is I can create a boundary shape with a polyline, and then I can analyze that. And so I can go area, and then I can go down here and I can say down arrow, object, click on the object. And then that will calculate that out at 267 square feet. Okay, so your job for module 7, come back to our main splash page, back over here, is to calculate out the room areas and to fill in the table with the correct sizes. That completes this video. I'm going to stop the recording and open things up for questions.